Namaste and good evening, everyone. Today we continue part 7 on dreams, out of body experiences. And today we will be having a special session because Sraddhalu will continue on this topic with more words that we received from Mother and Sri Aurobindo on the topic of inner senses and the higher worlds. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste and welcome to everybody.
We are happy to listen to you.
Yes. We have quite a large number of questions which have been pending, and I was weighing on whether to take up the questions first or dive deeper into this topic. And in particular, there is one question from Luke who asks how many layers there are, how many worlds or how many bodies, etc., because we come across different numbers. So I thought instead of taking up the questions first, we will do a deep dive into certain texts of Sri Aurobindo which build upon what we have already read and studied, but give us the underlying principles and truths of our inner senses. First, that will be one text, and then of the higher worlds, which will be another text. Why are there higher worlds, or what does a world mean in relation to who we are? Why at all worlds form? What's the relationship of the self with the worlds? And a deeper understanding of this will suddenly release us from the illusion that these are different worlds that we have to somehow access in an artificial way. What we will discover is that these are only relations that we can, from the self, choose to have with the working of Prakriti or nature. And it will free us from many limitations in our conception, in our understanding, and prepare us then for a still deeper and freer exploration. So first is the text on the inner senses. Both of these I have put as links in today's video description. And those of you who like to follow, it's okay, but I would still generally recommend let's just do it here now and you reread later on your own, because I will skip portions. I will only focus on the portions relevant for our study in the present. So the first text is from Sri Aurobindo in the Synthesis of Yoga, where he is describing the supramental senses. And this is towards the end of the Synthesis of Yoga, where he describes the supramental intelligence, memory, and then he comes to the senses. The primary content of the text relates to the supramental and how it infuses itself into us and raises all the workings to its freer, larger, and truer workings. So quite a bit of this I will edit out as we read. And interestingly, as part of this, Sri Aurobindo describes the subtler senses, which are of the mental, vital, and even subtle physical ranges, showing how all of these are, so to say, reflections or limited workings of a truer sense, which is the supramental sense. And more importantly, how when the supramental consciousness descends, it infuses itself in all these lower workings, raises them to its own higher truths, and allows us then to experience and participate in the reality of the cosmos across all these planes, even simultaneously and totally, entirely free of the confusions that exist when we operate in these lower planes with these lesser senses. So let's just take a look at the beginning of this chapter, where he says, all the instruments, all the activities of the mind have their corresponding powers in the action of the supramental energy. So in a sense, what we have, what we are, is a dumbed down, reduced, reflected, distorted, diffused, darkened, and narrowed version of what is a freer working in the supermind. Now this is very important to recognize, because it's not as if you have to somehow find a new sense or find a new way, a new consciousness. It's as if your existing consciousness is the tip, the tail end, And if you could, as if withdraw from its outward turn and gather into it as it is, and then drift back deeper towards its own source, towards its own fullness, towards its own depth and height, you would find yourself gradually opening, widening, and approaching that which is the supramental. So I will be careful not to allow the error that anything above mind is what Sri Aurobindo talks of as supramental. We make a very clear distinction of that supramental represents a specific grade, and above our intelligence there are many gradations which lead and prepare us towards that. He describes the working of the supramental sense in itself, which we don't need to go into at all now, but when you read on your own you will understand the context. Quite a bit of it, even half of the chapter is relating to things which we will entirely skip, but some important ideas which we will touch upon. The supramental sense, he says, can act in its own power and is independent of the body and the physical life and outer mind. It is above too the inner mind and its experiences. So it is not just part of the inner mind. It's not as if you enter the inner mind and you have experiences and you say, that's supramental. No, this is fundamentally different. But he says, it can be aware of all things in whatever world, on whatever plane, in whatever formation of universal consciousness. It, the supramental sense, can be aware of the things of the material universe even in the trance of samadhi, aware of them as they are or appear to the physical sense, even as it is of other states of experience, of the pure vital, the mental, the psychical, the supramental presentation of things. So eventually, as we will settle into the supramental sense, we will not lose this perception of the physical world, even in a state of trance. We would have full access not only to this, but to all these planes and to all their characteristic ways of experiencing, sensing, seeing, knowing. But with the addition that the supramental underlying would reveal the deeper truth behind still. The supramental transformation, we must understand, it's not like a withdrawal into some higher state which is disconnected from the world. It's not, as you will find in many of the New Age ideas, where they will, I think it's a made up story that the Mayans went into some higher plane and vanished, became invisible from the physical world, withdrew into some higher state of consciousness. Or as in certain traditions, they have the rainbow body or other luminous body, light body. It's none of that, because all those free you and disconnect from the physical world. And this is important to understand. The supramental consciousness, once established, will give you the full access, including of the physical world, even in a state of samadhi. It can, in the present state of the physical consciousness, present to us the things concealed from the limited receptivity or beyond the range of physical organs, distant forms, scenes, happenings, things that have passed out of physical existence or that are not yet in physical existence, scenes, forms, happenings, symbols of the vital, psychical, mental, supramental, spiritual worlds, and all these in their real or significant truth as well as their appearance. So, in this waking state of the physical consciousness, give you all this. So you'll still see the physical object, but you'll also see the underlying truth behind, of which it's a representation. It can use all the other states of sense consciousness and their appropriate senses and organs, adding to them what they have not, setting right their errors and supplying their deficiencies. How? Why can it do all this? For it is the source of the others, and they are only inferior derivations from this higher sense, this true and illimitable. Samjnana is the term he uses, which is the technical term in Sanskrit, in yoga. So first idea we have got is all this, which may properly be experienced in their own planes, levels, parts, inner, higher parts of our consciousness, are only inferior derivations from this higher sense. And the problem of our current development is you go into, let's say, the vital body, you see through the vital, you shift to the mental body, you experience through the mental, you come to the physical body, you experience through the physical. They are all separate, disconnected, different, and sometimes even conflicting. But when settled in the supramental sense, all these would be simultaneously visible, accessible, but infused with the truth that the supramental sense will give of the underlying thing behind, and all held in a completeness of their truth and their harmony. So, not only this gives us an idea of where we are going in our evolution and how that's going to be accomplished, but more important, that actually underlying all these different planes and these different experiences through different bodies or different domains of our consciousness, the underlying true perception is supramental and it is one. It is not different. It is only different because we are not living in that oneness of supramental. We live in those layers exclusively, separately, or partially. And therefore we have them as separate experiences of separate domains. This is the point I wanted to make in the fragment of the chapter which we have just read. And then he speaks of how the mental consciousness will be lifted into the supramental, and the physical senses will be supramentalized, and as a result, what will that physical sense become like? What will happen to the eyes, for example, and their seeing? He says, as soon as the sight, for example, becomes altered under the influence of the supramental seeing, the eye gets a new and transfigured vision of things and of the world around us. He is speaking now of the physical eyes and the physical senses of the eyes. Its sight acquires an extraordinary totality and an immediate and embracing precision in which the whole and every detail stand out at once in the complete harmony and vividness of the significance meant by nature in the object, and its realization of the idea in form, executed in a triumph of substantial being. This is something so beautiful, just described in one sentence, that I would want to elaborate for 10 minutes. But in a very cursory and limited way, I would say, you take a flower. Not only you will see the beauty of the flower, you will see the full subtle glow of the truth of the flower at the same time in its physicality, and it would be as vivid at the same time as everything else simultaneously, and you'll be aware of the whole in every detail, and every flower and the tree and the mountain, with this flower being entirely and totally vivid as all else. You see, normally our sight only sees vividly one thing and then blurs out all else. No, it's equally vivid. And you would see then also the complete harmony of all these, and what nature tried to express when she formed the flower. What was the idea behind, not as mental idea, but the true idea, real idea, behind which nature has actually materialized and given substantial form and in a triumph, because it's as if nature had to struggle against the resistance of matter and triumphantly produces this miracle that is the flower. And that whole thing would be visible simultaneously through your physical sight in your embodied physical consciousness. It is as if, he says, it is as if the eye of the poet and artist had replaced the vague or trivial unseeing normal vision, but singularly spiritualized and glorified, as if indeed it were the sight of the supreme divine poet and artist, in which we were participating. And they were given to us the full seeing of his truth and intention in his design of the universe and of each thing in the universe. So even as you're seeing the flower, you see the truth of what is intended in the flower design in the midst of the truth of the whole universe. There is an unlimited intensity which makes all that is seen a revelation of the glory of quality and idea and form and color. Unlimited intensity. Everything is a revelation of glory of quality. What is the flower quality? What is the idea of flower? And what is the form of flower and color of flower? All these amplified to unlimited intensity. Now, I'm not going to read more. There's much more which he says, and I will not read. This is just to give you a glimpse of the nature of that seeing, that sight. But the same happens with all the senses in the physical body with the supramentalization. But why is this important? Why are we dwelling on this? Because actually the inner sight which will belong to the inner physical consciousness, the, let's say, subtle physical, or even the inner vital and inner mental, is nothing but a limited expression of this. And as you go deeper within and above, it's as if the limitations become less and less. So when seen in this way, the awakening of inner sight is not something contrary, is not something in conflict with our existing experience. It is only an liberating from limitation. And all this we will understand when we speak of what is it that limits. There's another whole paragraph which I will skip, where he discusses how it is relating to the fullness of the Brahman. And he says all other senses undergo a similar transformation. Sound he describes. Now we come to the next para, where he says, there is at the same time an opening of new powers in all the senses, an extension of range, a stretching out of the physical consciousness to an undreamed capacity. Now try to dream of how far the physical senses could be expanded. Literally anything you can imagine. Oh, it will be so great, I will be able to see and feel across the whole universe, everything simultaneously, everything in depth, everything in 3D, 4D, whatever it is you choose. And well beyond that is the truth of what is experienced. But also new powers in all the senses. Things which currently you're not able to perceive with your physical sight would be part of the seeing of sight, and the extension of range and stretching out of the physical consciousness, where literally you will feel all as part of one whole, which is one universe itself as your body. The supramental transformation extends to the physical consciousness far beyond the limits of the body, and enables it to receive with a perfect concreteness the physical contact of things at a distance. Literally you can reach out and touch Jupiter, touch Arcturus or Belphegor, these are some of the biggest stars that we know, or taste, smell, hold in intimate physical contact everything, an entire galaxy or whole mass of galaxies, and so on. And the physical organs become capable of serving as channels for the psychic and other senses, so that we can see with the physical waking eye what is ordinarily revealed only in the abnormal states and to the psychical vision, hearing, or other sense knowledge. It is the spirit or the inner soul that sees and senses, but the body and its powers are themselves spiritualized and share directly in the experience. Now, remember, this is all the supramental transformation of our senses in the body. But everything else that we are speaking of, including the subtle experiences and subtle senses, of which we will read something now, would be a part of this, or what is experienced in those subtle states and abnormal states would be part of the physical life experience in the supramentalized consciousness, with full participation in the physical consciousness. It's not like so many New Age or even religious traditions will speak of as you're half in another world and your body is only there as a support. No, it is fully participating in everything that belongs in the higher worlds as experiences. The wall that the limitations of the body and its senses have built around us is abolished, even in the body and the senses. And there is in its place the free communication of the eternal oneness. So all that we are experiencing in terms of limitation, and those are the limitations we will now read about, are dissolved without losing the fullness of the physical experience. Rather, the physical experience is made more complete physically even. And in the midst of all this, all sensation becomes ananda. That's how he completes this paragraph. Now we come to the passage which I wanted to focus on for today. And this is part of our overall theme that we are studying. The embodied mind in us is ordinarily aware only through the physical organs and only of their objects, and of subjective experiences which seem to start from the physical experience and to take them alone, however remotely, for their foundation and mold of construction. So, what's our problem in our current state is that the mind that we are first mind, not body, but the mind that we are is embodied, it's identified with body. So we say, I am body, I am me. This is ordinarily aware. Under extraordinary circumstances, it can be made aware of other things. We call that unbalanced states, but ordinarily aware only through physical organs. So with sight, I see only the things which are the objects of the sight, and of subjective experiences which start from the physical experience. So I look at the flower, oh, it's a red, it triggers off a whole association of memories, perceptions, reactions, emotions. But the physical experience is the starting point. And even if you drift off into a daydream, it's still initiated from here. And the mold of construction and the foundation is still in the physical. So this is our current limitation. This is how we live. And we have almost convinced ourselves that this is all there is, because it's as if we have forgotten all else. And much of this has to do with the entry into the physical body at birth or before, and then the strong turn given by education which fixes you into the material more and more. But he says, in fact, there are immense ranges behind of which we could be aware if we opened the doors of our inner being. And those normally we have only in abnormal states. And he says that's not the way we want. We want to be able to open. If we open the doors of our inner being. What is this inner being? Like the proverbial tip of the iceberg, you have a 10% sticking out and then the mass below. So too our consciousness is, 1%, let's say, sticking out, but in a continuity, ranges within. These ranges are there already in action and known to a subliminal self in us. And much even of our surface consciousness is directly projected from them. And without our knowing, it influences our subjective experience of things. So, it's not like those things are asleep and blank and closed. They are already operating. And known to a self which is subliminal. Internally there's a layer that actually knows what's happening there. And that's us. But the surface us is not conscious of that inner us. On the other hand, from that inner us, there is an influence which comes into the surface us. Much even of our surface consciousness is directly projected from them. And we don't know that it's actually influencing our subjective experience of things. So quite a bit of what we think is our free choice and our very objective experience is modified by that whole underlying mass behind. There is a range of independent, vital or pranic experiences behind, subliminal too, and other than the surface action of the vitalized physical consciousness. So what do we know of our vital body? It's only the part of the vital body which is a vitalized physical. Again, like the mind identifying with the physical, and that's all we know. There we have insufficiency, there we are tired, and so on. Or here on the surface we are tired. There within we have a much greater freedom. So a range of independent vital or pranic experiences, subliminal too, and other than the surface action of this vital. And when this opens itself or acts in any way, there are made manifest to the waking mind the phenomena of a vital consciousness, a vital intuition, a vital sense, not dependent on the body and its instruments, although it may use them as a secondary medium and a recorder. Now you see, we are not talking of the supramental anymore. We are talking of this range which is below. And then he will put it all again in context with the supermind. But understand how this functions here. I will not elaborate too much except on a few key portions which relate to our overall theme. It is possible to open completely this range. And when we do so, we find that its operation is that of the conscious life force individualized in us, contacting the universal life force and its operation in things, happenings, and persons. So, this individual life force is linked with, in a continuum, with the universal life force working in all things. That's how we experience it when we are able to open completely this range. Now, for many people, there is a slightly wider opening, and these people you will find have a certain excess of vital energy, or they have a kind of a command over the vitality in the immediate circumstances. So very powerful leaders, for example, they can walk into a room, literally seize the vitality in the air, make the atmosphere electric in intensity, possess, seize, mold, shape people, influence, compel them, etc. Not conscious of how they do it, but conscious that they are doing it. And this is simply because there's a partial opening to this in this level, and it's a very partial opening. He continues, the mind becomes aware of the life consciousness in all things, responds to it through our life consciousness with an immediate directness, not limited by the ordinary communication through the body and its organs, records its intuitions, becomes capable of experiencing existence as a translation of the universal life or prana. Play of energies, etc. I'm not going to go into detail here. It's a pretty long description. But this is all to understand that this domain is already present in us. We are as if already in our vitality plugged into the vital world. And the part of the consciousness which is plugged into the vital world or is formed of the vital substance largely comprises our vital body. Now, if you wanted to, so to say, project yourself out in your vital body, partially or fully, you cannot be just a malleable mass of the same vital force that flows in the vital world. It needs to have some kind of an individualized concentration that it can disengage from the physical body and float freely and operate freely as an independent unit. If it is not well formed and individualized, it floats out, blurs out, and becomes literally like a wave in the universal ocean of vitality. It cannot come into its own and stand in its own to be able to act upon and register things. It can be independent only when it identifies with the physical body and thereby limits itself into a narrow, bound vitality. But then it cannot live independently, and it's always dulled by the nature of the physical body and its identification with. So you understand that if you want to experience things of those worlds as an independent unit, you cannot just be a part of this knot of vital energy, which is what our body is currently, our vital body is currently, but it must be sufficiently individualized, brought into your awareness in a way that your awareness can seize and hold the form of your vital body. Live in it independently of the narrowness required or compelled upon it by the physical body. And then only you can have that experience. So there are in fact occult traditions where they spend a lot of time helping you to develop the individualization of the vital body before you are capable of doing a conscious out-of-body projection. In fact, a lot of the exercises which you will find in existing literature on exteriorization or even other developing other capacities and powers and experiences are primarily focused on this by an indirect means. Even we have referred to the thing as the Velo method, of which we will speak much more in detail the next time we have this topic. But as a practice, it is intended originally to help, not that the person who created it has thought of it like that, but it's intended as if to form the continuity and the distinctiveness of the vital body so that it can have a distinctive experience, register it, retain it, and even build a continuity. So, but still, Even then, so long as it is on the mental level, the experience is limited by the vital terms and their mental renderings, and there is an obscurity even in the greatened sense and knowledge. I've skipped portions. But so what would make this complete, free in its mastery? And that's where we come to the supramental transformation. Supra vitalizes the vital, reveals it as a dynamics of the spirit, makes a complete opening and a true revelation of all the spiritual reality behind and within the life force and the life spirit, and of all its spiritual as well as its mental and purely vital truth and significance. So the supermind in its descent into the physical being awakens, if not already awakened by previous yogic sadhana, the consciousness, veiled or obscured in most of us, which supports and forms there the vital sheath, the prana kosha. So what is within us, largely he says veiled or obscured in most of us, is now awakened and made complete by this supramental descent into the physical body. When this is awakened, we no longer live in the physical body alone, but also in a vital body which penetrates and envelops the physical body and is sensitive to the impacts of another kind, to the play of the vital forces around us and coming in on us from the universe or from particular persons or group lives or from things or else from the vital planes and worlds which are behind this material universe. Now, this would be the spiritual way. You go rapidly into the deeper, higher ranges of consciousness, attain to the highest, and then bring them down or forward from within. And as these infuse, as this awaken and transform the surface and lower ranges, they automatically form and awaken us to the truth and the capacities of those levels. This would be the spiritual way. In practice, one does not have to wait all the way for the supramental to be brought. Even the mind opening to higher consciousness, allowing it to flow down. And whatever that may be, everything above higher mind, above the mind, can be received. But particularly, and this would be our reference more and more, that the influence of the intuitive mind descending, settling in us, awakening and disengaging these layers of our consciousness which are presently all blurred in a formless mass continuum, distinguishing, separating, forming, individualizing and giving or awakening consciousness in each of these layers. This would be the spiritual way, and therefore inevitably all the capacities which would come with such a shift and waking in the vital body would be available to you naturally, including out of body states, so when you choose to. But you could equally have those experiences while being in the body, simply by shifting the focus of awareness on that level and being able to access things of that world simultaneously as you are in the physical embodied state equally. These impacts we feel even now in their result and in certain touches and affectations, but not at all and very little in their source and their coming. An awakened consciousness in the pranic body immediately feels them, is aware of a pervading vital force other than the physical energy, and can draw upon it and increase the vital strength and support the physical energies, can deal directly with the phenomena and causes of health and disease by means of this vital influx, or by directing pranic currents, can be aware of the vital and the vital emotional atmosphere of others and deal with its interchanges, along with a host of other phenomena which are unfelt by or obscure to our outward consciousness, but here become conscient and sensible. So here's a whole range of things which just open up simply by that descent filling and awakening the vital body and individuality. This would be the spiritual way. The occult way, which is a bottom up, is by concentrating on the vital, by shifting awareness up and down, as for example in the Velo method, You try to feel sensation of energy moving layer by layer, part by part, all through. And as you feel, you find there are gaps, there are blanks. And by forcing the feeling, sensation, you're, so to say, filling in the gaps and forming the consciousness of the vital body. It's not a sensation of the physical, it's the whole goal in that exercise is of the vital. We will speak about this exercise later, and I will present it in a way that will be much more meaningful from the context of the integral yoga, and which will allow you to much more rapidly develop this capacity. But for now, if you remember a discussion we had last time, the descent of peace as a practice, the descent of the higher consciousness as a practice, filling the physical consciousness and awakening you to your subtle physical, is the base upon which all this becomes possible. Once you feel this dense peace within you, with it the awareness of the subtle physical will form. You'll feel your boundaries as if larger than the gross physical. In that, to distinguish the vital and mental layers becomes almost natural and easy. If you get to this first, all the rest becomes accessible. If you don't have this as a base, you can struggle for years and years and still get to not much. So, for the moment, I will not focus on the processes of exploration that we will use. Simply understand the process of how this happens, and then we will see what we do about it. He describes further what happens when you begin to live in this widened life consciousness and so on. But we'll skip that. Because all this now relates to what comes under the gradation of category of psychical phenomena. And there's a whole paragraph where he discusses this. Again, I'm going to skip that. He says, the phenomena of this vital consciousness and sense, this direct sensation and perception of and response to the play of subtler forces than the physical, are often included without distinction under the head of psychical phenomena. But well, we have to distinguish. In a sense, it is an awakening of the psyche, the inner soul now hidden, clogged wholly or partially covered up by the superficial activity of the physical mind and senses, that brings to the surface the submerged or subliminal inner vital consciousness. So what's our problem right now, he says? The inner ranges are clogged wholly or partially covered up by the superficial activity of the physical mind and senses. That's all. Because of this superficial activity of the mind, physical mind and senses, your mind embedded in the body that says, oh, I am this thinking body, I am born with the body, die with the body, I have hands, arms, legs, I feel unhappy, I have ripples of thoughts. This part of mind in which we live identified largely, and the physical senses through which you look at the universe. You're so fixed in this that it covers up everything else. So the first step would be as if to disengage from this and shift in a little bit, just a little bit, and already you will have access to so many things, because there's so much more that's waiting, but just a little bit. But this movement is so difficult. Why? Because we don't even know what it feels like. And when that starts happening, actually, if by some push or help or grace, you immediately react and say, oh, I'm losing my balance, I feel floating, or I feel as if I'm going to fall, etc. Because you have habituated yourself. It's almost as if I may give an analogy here of somebody who's living in a cage, bound to the bars of the cage, clinging to the bars and looking through the bars all your life from childhood. You've been born like this. You've never turned around and seen that the cage at the back is fully open. And so when somebody says, with your hands fixed on the bars, somebody says, let go of the bars, what does that mean? I don't even know what it means. And if somebody by force opens your fingers to let go of the bars, you say, oh, someone's breaking my fingers. And if they manage somehow to free you, you suddenly say, I have lost my balance. Where are my bars? My cage is gone. I don't exist. I am dead. Or so it feels. by the prior fixed idea that this alone is real and true, and any release from this is unreal or fantasy or whatever. So that's why the initial movement requires a little bit of habituating to let go and then be free, and then again cling back. And as I've repeatedly mentioned, the practice of the descent of peace, in which as a result of the descent of peace you shift into the subtle physical awareness and can feel yourself as this larger swollen body form, much more dense than the gross physical. This is like a base. Get to this, and from this everything else will be easier. So he describes the working of this inner action and how the inferior action is this error and deformation full of false suggestions and images. And he says this is the inferior activity to which clairvoyants, psychists, spiritists, occultists, seekers of powers and siddhis are very liable, and to which all the warnings against the dangers and errors of this kind of seeking are more especially applicable. This inferior working is where you've just disengaged a little bit, and then you start exploring in the immediate range rather than going deeper and higher to the spiritual part of yourself. You stop there and then start exploring, and even that does not happen easily. You have to force your way sometimes. But that's where you're full of false suggestions. Much of this is happening in the current world today, largely because of people using these certain forms of substances, psychedelic substances, where momentarily, as if you're disengaged from the surface physical identification, but opening to a very narrow band close to the physical. And then anything can happen, any suggestion can be picked up as true and real, and very deceptive. You may be convinced in that state, oh, this is true. But in fact, from a deeper or higher range, or even when you come back to the physical consciousness, it seems almost a fantasy or wrong. So, what is our way? The seeker of spiritual perfection has to pass as quickly as possible, if he cannot altogether avoid, this zone of danger. And the safe rule here is to be attached to none of these things, but to make spiritual progress one's sole, real objective, and to put no sure confidence in other things until the mind and life soul are purified and the light of the spirit and supermind, or at least of the spiritually illumined mind and soul, are shed on these inner ranges of experience. For when the mind is tranquilized and purified and the pure psyche liberated from the insistence of the desire soul, these experiences are free from any serious danger, except indeed that of limitation and of certain element of error, which cannot be entirely eliminated so long as the soul experiences and acts on the mental level. So what do you need to do? Mind has to be tranquilized and purified, and the pure psyche liberated from the insistence of the desire soul. The desire soul is this part, again in the embodied form, which says, I want to be great, I want to achieve this, I want to realize that, I want to be known, overcome this, defeat that, become first or second or whatever it is. Your primary drives are based on impulsive desires. Of what kind? Things which aggrandize and make your emotions and desires feel more intense or more important. But if you become very quiet, and if you go behind this impulsiveness of the desire, there's a different kind of, we may use the word desire, but it's no more of an emotional, vital kind, but a true aspiration of the soul, which says, yes, I would like to grow unendingly. But whether I defeat or overcome someone or something is somehow not so important there. And this comes in a state of tranquility and calm and clarity. And this is where the pure psyche, liberated from the desired soul's insistence, is felt. Now, you don't have to reach the full purity of this. You don't have to even attain the full tranquility and purification of the mind. A base in this, a base of familiarity in this is enough. Get to that. And that's why again I'm pointing to the descent of peace as a reference, because you will experience as a result of that descent your mind completely still and quiet, and you will not feel your emotions intense. You'll be able to feel a layer which is still and quiet and large behind the emotions. And so the familiarity for these states becomes now natural, to the point that in the middle of your daily work routine, you should be able to quiet yourself, disengage, step back as if, and shift to this deeper, calmer, wider, freer state and poise. And then again re-engage. So if you have done that as an exercise in the beginning of the day, in the middle of the day multiple times, you step back, recall the peace, depth, intensity, wideness, denseness of the peace, to whatever extent you recover, even if it's 10%, come back to that. And he says with that, these experiences are freed from any serious danger. Of course, you have the usual dangers which come with the limitations of the mind, but it's no more a problem. For there is then a pure action of the true psychical consciousness and its powers, a reception of the psychical experience pure in itself of the worst deformations, although subject to the limitations of the representing mind, and capable of a high spiritualization and light. And of course, it's only when the supramental comes that the fullness of it will be reached. But this is our first base. Work on this consciously. Make this your reference. And then the exploration which will follow, including out-of-body experiences or other capacities, would be largely held in a safe range and capability. Most of the dangers would be avoided by this. Now, Sri Aurobindo describes broadly the range of experiences which are accessible in this state. And we will read through some of this. The range of the psychic consciousness, by psychic is meant here the psychical of the inner worlds, not of the inmost psychic as soul, the inner ranges. The range of the psychic consciousness and its experiences is almost illimitable, and the variety and complexity of its phenomena almost infinite. Only some of the broad lines and main features can be noted here. And you'll find this repeated by everybody who has experiences on these levels, whether in out of body or other wise. And you'll find again and again the mother will say things like, everything that's possible can happen, and you can only draw broad lines. You cannot say it's always like this and not like that, because this is a domain of great freedom. So only some of the broad lines and main features can be noted here. The first and most prominent is the activity of the psychic senses, of which the sight is the most developed ordinarily, and the first to manifest itself with any largeness when the veil of the absorption in the surface consciousness, which prevents the inner vision, is broken. So again we are reminded of what is the key here. We have an absorption in the surface consciousness which prevents the inner vision. And this absorption itself is the veil. The moment you are able to quiet yourself and disengage and actually be aware without needing to be outwardly turned, you are beginning to, so to say, cross the veil or form a bridge across the veil. And the first thing typically is of the sight. But all the physical senses have their corresponding powers in the psychical being. There is a psychical hearing, touch, smell, taste. Indeed, the physical senses are themselves in reality only a projection of the inner sense into a limited and externalized operation, in and through and upon the phenomena of gross matter. So again, an interesting idea. What you're actually doing when you see with your physical sight, you're using the inner sense projected into the limited and externalized operation and through the external sight and upon the gross matter. What actually behind is the operation of the inner sense. So now if you could, so to say, simply withdraw your senses from the fixation of the biology consciousness and hold the senses in themselves as they are, you would have already accessed the freedom of the inner senses. But the ability to disengage from the gross physical consciousness and hold this inner poise is your first step. And then you can turn the same senses to any direction, any purpose, any object. Initially, of course, directed towards the inner plunge or upward opening and so on. The psychical sight receives characteristically the images that are formed in the subtle matter of the mental or psychical ether. I hope the streaming is okay. Okay. Come back to the text. The psychical sight receives characteristically the images that are formed in the subtle matter of the mental or psychical ether. So things which are happening on that level, because that's where the sense is primarily based. These may be transcriptions there or impresses of physical things, persons, scenes, happenings, whatever is, was or will be or may be in the physical universe. So here's the problem with the subtle sight. What was, what is, what might be are all equally visible, or any one of these might pop up as a visibility, as an image, as a perception. So typically what happens when people who have an opening on this level will say, oh, I'm clairvoyant and I see this, and then they come wrong. It's because of this. Because they cannot distinguish whether they're seeing a possibility or a happening from the past, or even a suggestion or a tendency which is trying to happen now, as distinct from what will actually happen or what has happened. And the two get blurred. So this is often an experience in the out-of-body state. You will find many have documented this. Mark also documents. He goes to a place in the subtle body, sees something, comes back in the physical world to the same place, and there's a difference. So on that, in the subtle body, he has seen certain things which don't exist physically. So in some cases it has happened that he asks people around and they say, yes, 10 years ago or 20 years ago we had this, that's been removed. Or in other cases, it was never there, but 2 years later when he comes, he finds that thing is there. So you are seeing the future or the past. So in the subtle body, you have gone to what seemed to you like the physical world, and you're seeing the physical world, but you're actually seeing the past or the future or some tendency. And how do you actually, at that moment, focus on the physical reality as it is, or how do you know what you're seeing represents the future or the past, or a tendency that's trying to happen but might be defeated ultimately? And this is where the fundamental change in your consciousness makes all the difference. If you have received enough of the spiritual light and the intuitive consciousness, you would, on seeing, sense and know, this is a future trying to actualize. And depending on how well that thing is developed, you might get a sense of the likelihood, it might actualize in about 6 months. But you also sense what are the forces for or against it. Such would be natural to a supramentalized consciousness. But right now you're just going with your current mind. So the limitations of your mind are acting, in which you see this. You think it is already there, but you find that it is not yet on the physical plane. So that's why he says these are transcriptions often. The images are very variously seen and under all kinds of conditions, in samadhi or in the waking state. And in the latter, with the bodily eyes closed or open, projected on or into a physical object or medium, or seen as if materialized in the physical atmosphere, or only a psychical ether revealing itself through this grosser physical atmosphere. Seen through the physical eyes themselves as a secondary instrument, and as if under the conditions of the physical vision, or by the psychical vision alone and independent of the relation of our ordinary sight to space. Now just here in one sentence, he has categorized a dozen different variations of how that perception could take place. So, for example, let's take a case of a clairvoyant looking at you for medical conditions, or just looking at your aura, and the person sees some form, some shape, some dark patch in the aura. What are they seeing? How are they seeing? Is it the inner sight seeing on the subtle plane overlaid on the physical sight? Or is it the inner sight working through the physical sight that inserts it? Or do you experience the inner sight as distinct from the physical sight as two simultaneous seeings which in your mind you overlay? For example, any of these could be possible. All depends on the person and the particular line of development, integration, etc. I recall reading in Ingo Swan's descriptions, I believe, when he saw in many people, he would see sometimes a black rectangular patch, but like sharp edges of a rectangle, sometimes on the person's chest or head. He couldn't make out. What does it mean? Why is it rectangular? He couldn't make out. The only thing he noticed was that in a very short time the person's died. So he learned to associate that with this. But what is it really? The consciousness which is experiencing cannot know. And this is the limitation of just the inner sight opening. But in all these variations, or it could be as if materialized. So you could see the thing, for example, on the person as if it's a material thing you could hold, except you can't. Or you see it as if in a overlay and you can feel it's a finer grade. And so on, all the variations possible which he has listed here. The real agent is always the psychical sight, and the power indicates that the consciousness is more or less awake, intermittently or normally, and more or less perfectly in the psychical body. It is possible to see in this way the transcriptions or impressions of things at any distance beyond the range of the physical vision, or the images of the past or the future. So a lot of the remote viewing was done in this way, by whatever protocols they follow, irrespective of the protocol. They could see things far away, any distance, literally distance doesn't matter, or into the past or the future. But it's done by this opening of in the vital body. He describes other things. Besides these transcriptions or impresses, the psychical vision receives thought images and other forms created by constant activity of consciousness in ourselves or in other human beings. And these may be, according to the character of the activity, images of truth or falsehood, or else mixed things, partly true, partly false, and maybe to either mere shells and representations or images, inspired by temporary life and consciousness. It may be carrying in them in one way or another some kind of beneficent or maleficent action, or some willed or unwilled effectiveness on our minds or vital beings, or through them even on the body. Now here's again a huge range of phenomena, and one could elaborate on each one to give examples. I'm just going to skip. Think about each of these and you will find a lot of literature out there. Even things projected from other beings, I'm summarizing now. A lot of things of these come under the category called clairvoyance, and then you have clairaudience for the hearing, clairsentience for the senses, and so on. And a whole range of varieties in each. So, he says, these and other phenomena create an indirect, a representative range of psychical experience, but it's always indirect. But the psychical sense has also the power of putting us in a more direct communication with earthly or supra-terrestrial beings through their psychical selves, or their psychical bodies, or even with things, for things also have a psychical reality, and souls or presences supporting them, which can communicate with our psychical consciousness. So, you indirectly sense what is happening in the physical world or pick up things from the mental world, but you can also directly engage with things which belong properly to its domain. So, beings on those worlds, or a person who is a physical being but has that subtle body of the psychical level, and you connect with the psychical body but not with the physical body, but there it's more direct as a contact. And even objects. So he says things also have a psychical reality and souls or presences supporting them. So here's an interesting idea. A mountain also might have a soul or a being which supports, or a presence without even having a form of being. But then you will relate to that thing on that level directly. Or it could be simply supporting. You take an apple, it has a physical form, it has also life force and a body of life force. You take an object which has been used by somebody, it has a physical form, but it has also infused in it the consciousness and life force of the person who used it. If the person had a strong desire attachment to it, something of that will be there as a substantial presence attached to it, which you can sense and feel and engage with, and so on. So this becomes the basis for a whole other range of activities. So you see how Sri Aurobindo, rather than going with a few thousand examples, which is what one would have to do to really show the full spread, shows you the broad categories of each phenomenon, and anything you have experienced you will find fits in one of these, and that's how comprehensive the description is. But here's the most important part for which we took this text now. The most notable of these, more powerful but rarer phenomena, are those which attend the power of exteriorization of our consciousness for various kinds of action, otherwise and elsewhere than in the physical body. So these are far more powerful but much more rare as phenomena. The power of exteriorization of consciousness. You can have various kinds of action otherwise and elsewhere than in the physical body. So otherwise meaning not in the physical body but also elsewhere, far away from the physical body. Communication in the psychical body, or some emanation or reproduction of it. So you can communicate in an exteriorized state, or some emanation can be exteriorized, or a reproduction of it can be projected. Now this is a whole range of categories you will not find listed in so much of the literature. It's not always simply that your vital body goes out. There's a part of the vital body that projects out. So that's why there may be degrees of exteriorization. But it's also possible that a part of the vital body goes out and forms the shape of the whole vital body. In which case, this is what he is describing here, a reproduction of the vital body. There is even a whole category of phenomena which are taught in certain occult schools where you visualize yourself in a vital body projected out of the physical, enter into it, make that like a shell, and then project with it. And that becomes a whole kind of, so to say, projection. But strictly speaking, that will not be what we will call an out-of-body experience. That would involve a true out-of-body experience, would require a reasonably complete exteriorization, where you actually have the subtle body, your vital body, intact entirely, not a partial projection, etc. Oftenest, though by no means necessarily, during sleep or trance. So again, just in a brief glimpse of a few words, he has put a few categories. During sleep, you have this exteriorization. During trance, meaning not sleep, you have an exteriorization. But not necessarily sleep or trance. You can even be in physical body with aware consciousness and have an exteriorization. Interesting. But this would require a great mastery. I have mentioned before perhaps Madame Blavatsky, being one of the great occultists of the recent times, she had this ability to operate on multiple levels at the same time while still being in the physical body and working. And there was once somebody had moved a stool, and as she was walking, she stumbled over it. So obviously the question you would ask is, couldn't she see? So she explained that she was at that time working simultaneously on another plane in another body. So a large part of her consciousness was exteriorized, and the physical body was allowed to do its thing mechanically. But it did not have the same kind of distinction of awareness. So something shifted physically, it was not able to manage on its own. It needed the mind to be present in an individualized way to be able to handle that. So I remember among many of the interviews which we had done with disciples in the ashram, that one of the things we were told by those who had attended on the mother, that she was very particular that things should not be moved around physically. Objects in her room should not be changed, moved around, displaced. There were many reasons. This was one of them. Another reason was also that she had often placed these objects with a certain intention, and often the objects represented something larger behind. And by placing them in certain ways, she was actually operating on circumstances, on an occult level, on a spiritual level. And by moving them, one would be intruding in that also. So this is something which also was present simultaneously for her. But the point is, you can be actually operating on other planes in a partial exteriorization even without this physical body being in a state of sleep or trance. And the setting up of relations or communication by various means with the denizens of another plane of existence. So you can set up relationships, communications, and many ways of doing that with these beings. Now, I'll give an example of somebody I had met who is also clairvoyant in a highly developed way. And she was describing how, not once, but it's happened, many examples she had given, but one was, she was working in her house, and suddenly this person whom she knew because he used to visit her workspace, this person comes in the subtle body and says that he is in the hospital and he is on some ventilator, and he is asking her to come and free him from that machinery. And first she said, my tendency is to ignore all these types, because what happens is, once you are able to hear or sense things on those planes, beings of those planes can detect you as being able to sense them. And this is it's a two-way game. You can't always say, I will be perceptive but not be intruded upon by others. So, well, obviously they come and bother you. Can you help out, please? And she kept throwing him off. No, I don't have time. Don't disturb me. Stop bothering me. But it lasted for many hours persistently. Finally, she says, okay. And then she went and she did whatever was required. So Mark Oburn also shares this. I mentioned before that he would have people come who had passed on and try to send messages through him. And he would just blow it off saying, no, I will never get into that sort of thing. With a few exceptions which he mentions in his book. But the point is, all this becomes naturally, obviously, spontaneously accessible as one begins to be aware on those levels. And for many of us, it would be a question you would want to really ask. Do you want to do that now? Or is the ignorance and the lack of awareness on these levels a kind of a protection or even a gift? But then it's a question one has to really answer only with an experience. Because to not have this wider access is to live always shut and bound in your little prison and cage. To have that access is a freedom, but as a freedom it can bind you in a larger cage. The thing though, which would be our way spiritually, is to go all the way as quickly as possible to the soul, the self, and the highest supramental consciousness. And with each inward and higher step, infuse, bring, and whatever it chooses to awaken, organize, and shape in you as completely as possible. And in the process, many of these things might open. You may or may not choose to develop those capacities, because even on those levels, as an ability opens, one may need to develop to really make it perfect. Or you may choose to simply ignore them, having an ability, ignoring it, so that you may continue this pursuit and make more complete this process of awakening and infusing and transforming. And it is only in a late stage, with the higher intuitive, overmental, and eventually supramental influence settling in you and organizing things, that the perfection of all these capacities would naturally happen. And such may be the trajectory that one chooses. Or, as part of this trajectory, intermediate certain powers and capacities might develop, and you may choose to utilize them because they align with certain tendencies, either of your nature or of your soul's aspiration. Either way, it's a choice one would make, of which the first choice and the first priority must be this inner and higher development and the awakening to the spiritual first. And all this would be a consequence naturally. Now we go to the next paragraph. Having described all this, Sri Aurobindo says, what else is there? And what's the direction in which this kind of a development goes? For there is a continuous scale of the planes of consciousness, beginning with the psychical and other belts attached to and dependent on the earth plane, and proceeding through the true independent vital and psychical worlds to the worlds of the gods and the highest supramental and spiritual planes of existence. So, continuous scale of the planes of consciousness. What's the lowest? The psychical and other belts attached to and dependent on the earth plane. So there is a zone of the vital which is attached to and dependent on the physical. That's where you have experiences which are closest to the physical. But then from there, you proceed through the true and independent vital and psychical worlds. Why is he saying vital and psychical? Again, there's a distinction we have to make. Psychical generally relates to the inner ranges. Vital would relate specifically to a grade, a band, within which there could be ranges which are also of an inner. So, the sense of the world itself has qualities, and you cannot reduce or represent this in terms of dimensions. Dimensionality is a term which has a physical basis. You see, 3 dimensions, they are as if directions perpendicular to each other. A 4th dimension, one could say, would be as if something, an inward turn, and that's why the inner is as if a 4th dimension. But once in the inner, it is rather an blooming out into qualities and directions of qualities. It's no more the sense of dimensionality as in space. So there's no such thing as beyond 4 dimensions, 5, 6, 7, 8. In terms of dimensionality, there is no meaning and does not correspond to the reality of these experiences. But within it, there are qualities, and the qualitative shifts could be experienced as directions, and then there are many. You could take any plane and focus into its range which turns towards beauty, which turns towards power, which turns towards specific characteristics, and find worlds and worlds of these kinds. So, the sense of the psychical is much more of the inward ranges than just the more grosser kind of that grade. So, through the true independent vital, independent as a vital, not dependent on the physical, and psychical worlds, to the worlds of the gods and the highest supramental and spiritual planes of existence. So, passing through the mental, obviously. And these are in fact always acting upon our subliminal selves, unknown to our waking mind, and with considerable effect on our life and nature. Considerable effect. There's a huge influence from all these things upon us. The physical mind is only a little part of us, and there is a much more considerable range of our being in which the presence, influence and powers of the other planes are active upon us and help to shape our external being and its activities. So look at it this way. This little tip of your physical mind, and the iceberg behind, let's say 99% of it. And there, in those layers, you have experiences coming from all the planes, from below, from above, from around, modifying, influencing things, and from there, as if reflecting on the surface, influencing, even fundamentally changing outcomes. The awakening of the psychical consciousness enables us to become aware of these powers, presences, and influences in and around us. First step, you'll be aware. You won't be able to always change. And while in the impure or yet ignorant and imperfect mind, this unveiled contact has its dangers. It enables us to, if rightly used and directed, to be no longer their subject but their master, and to come into conscious and self-controlled possession of the inner secrets of our nature. So first is awareness. You're aware that's happening. From that awareness comes the, if rightly used and directed, the capacity now to modify and even to master, initially at least, your own space upon which all these things are impacting, so that you can choose what acts on you, what does not. And then naturally, as a consequence, you can choose to act upon, because if something is coming in and you choose to push back, you are influencing things outside. Take that to the next step. You are actively projecting an outcome, actually sensing an outcome happening in your environment and choosing then to intervene to modify. It's not directly in you, but still it's in your environment, and so on. So eventually it would lead to conscious, self-controlled possession of the inner secrets of our nature. The psychical consciousness reveals this interaction between the inner and the outer planes, this world and others, partly by an awareness which may be very constant, vast and vivid, of their impacts, suggestions, communications to our inner thought and conscious being, and a capacity of reaction upon them there, partly also through many kinds of symbolic, transcriptive or representative images presented to the different psychical senses. So here we actually need to go into certain kinds of experience to fully appreciate what he is describing. But first of all, he says you can have an awareness which is very constant. Need not be always, but it can be quite constant. It can be an awareness which is vast. It can include the sense of what's happening somewhere in the world, or which can be quite vivid also. Again, if I may draw on a few examples from Mark's narrations. In the conference, I think Mark mentioned this, that one of the things which had happened in his experiences was, at some point as he was doing some work, he sensed a ripple effect in the atmosphere, obviously on the whole earth, of a person who had just attained to realization. The moment of that person's awakening into that literally created a ripple, a shock wave that spread through the whole planet, and it hit him and he was conscious of it. Interesting observation. But what it shows you is things happening in these ways which we are not normally conscious of. You just become conscious. You may not always know from where. You don't need to know who the person is. You could at that time, of course, turn your attention, seek to know, reach out and so on. But you would still have a sense and say, oh, okay, that's what's happening. So, and then there are symbolic representations. Something is happening which is represented to you symbolically, and you can modify the thing through the symbol. And this is what I mentioned earlier, the mother was doing through some of the things, physical objects, even in her room. And sometimes these also involved certain deities and powers which were of a spiritual kind that she held physically linked and impacted certain circumstances and so on. So it's quite fascinating once you get into this kind of a thing, but finally, as the experience is open, it becomes obvious. But here is in summary form a description of all this. Even you see nuances that Sri Aurobindo brings through many kinds of symbolic, transcriptive or representative images presented through to the different psychical senses. 3 words: symbolic, transcriptive or representative. There are 3 ways in which truths of higher planes or circumstances or influences of the subtle worlds can be represented to you through the various senses. Let's say in image, in object form perceived through the subtle, you would have a symbolic representation, you would have a transcribed representation or a representative image. And you can see the symbolic would be the most powerful, transcription would be as if from a higher plane, some reduced version, and then a representative image as if like the tail end of something which is entirely elsewhere. These would be 3 degrees on which one would act or receive, and so on. Only somebody who has really mastered the domain of phenomena on these planes can give you such an accurate description, and he still says it's broad lines of all that's possible. And this gives you a glimpse of the mastery that Sri Aurobindo had. You must understand, Sri Aurobindo attained to this. Let's say he's writing this in 19 perhaps, if I have it right, towards the end of the Arya years. And he has been doing the intense sadhana for less than 10 years at that point. How would one reach this level of mastery? Not by the slow occult process bottom up, but by the most rapid means to reach the highest and then bringing that highest and attaining to the mastery through its action. And so such is the broad direction highly recommended in the integral yoga, but to which there will always be variations and exceptions depending on our needs and the soul's aspirations and natural proclivities inherited from work done in the past. I mean, not inherited, but carried over from past lives and incarnations, where we have also perhaps developed certain aspects. So this, and the last sentence of this paragraph. But also there is the possibility of a more direct, concretely sensible, almost material, sometimes actively material communication. A complete, though temporary, physical materialization seems to be possible with the powers, forces and beings of other worlds and planes. So powers, forces and beings of other worlds and planes, you can have a more direct, completely sensible, almost material, and sometimes actively material communication. This gives you again a glimpse of gradations, degrees in which that contact could be had. So in the very first, you have a direct contact. Let's say Sri Aurobindo was translating the verses from the Veda, Hymns to the Mystic Fire. Now this is one of the volumes which is printed. I have not met anybody so far who can say I have read that whole volume. They are translations of the Vedic verses, Hymns to the Mystic Fire, Hymns to Agni. Sri Aurobindo has translated them. He's taken the trouble to translate them, and this is all in the 1930s, literally late 30s, so about 15 years before he leaves his body. Why is he spending hours translating the verses from the Veda, hymns to Agni? It's around the time when he has just started Savitri also. Obviously there was some great value to it. And Mother says when he was doing the translation, Agni would be present in front, standing before Sri Aurobindo. It cannot get more direct than that. A direct contact with, let's say, Agni in this case. But the contact may be direct in consciousness. That contact might be concretely sensible, tangibility increased. From there, almost material insensibility. And then sometimes actively material communication. Almost a complete, though temporary, physical materialization seems to be possible. So Agni would come that close while Sri Aurobindo was working on these translations. With the powers, forces and beings of other worlds and planes. Again, distinctions between powers, forces, beings, distinctions between worlds and planes. So straight away you see 4 degrees of contact with 3 different kinds of things on 2 different domains. So 24 variations to the experience, all summarized in one sentence. There may even be a complete breaking of the limits of the physical consciousness and the material existence. And this is left undescribed because this opens to so many things which seem almost impossible. And I have shared a few things which I've heard about of this kind, and it's almost as if the materiality of things seems to be transcended at that point. An overmental being that is almost physically materialized, sometimes identified with a human being. And I mentioned this example some time back recently of a person who so held that, floating in the air and being semi-transparent and giving a darshan in that state. And there may even be a complete breaking of the limits of the physical consciousness and the material existence. At that point you wonder what is matter and what is subtle world, and is there even a difference? But it doesn't last, it passes, because matter is still too dense, too rigid. It will only accept to be momentarily, temporarily seized upon, but eventually must compel itself to return, until and unless the highest supramental consciousness were to seize upon it, and only then it will yield, because that is the source of this. It's only when the highest meets the lowest that there can be this perfect liberation and the complete breaking of the limits of the physical existence. And then the possibilities of that creation, which will be the nature of the supramental manifestation, are beyond our conception and potentially unending. So there's actually 2-3 more paragraphs which are quite significant, but I don't think we will have the time to look at it. I will only touch upon a little bit of this, because we must now bring this back to our practice and the spiritual life. All these powers, the awakening of the psychical consciousness liberates in us the direct use of the mind as the sixth sense, and this power may be made constant and normal. And so he speaks of how the mind can act, and the physical consciousness normally communicates with the minds of others through external organs, through external symbols, but actually on a subtle level the mind is interacting with mind, and all kinds of things are happening which we are not conscious of. And as the psychical consciousness, psychical meaning generally the inner, developing, makes us aware of the great mass of thoughts, feelings, suggestions, will, impacts, etc. And as it grows in precision and capacity, he says, we are able to trace, and clarity, we are able to trace these to their source, or feel immediately their origin and transit to us, and direct consciously and with an intelligent will our own messages. So let's say a thought form comes and nudges you. You caught an idea. You can say, it came from outside. Stop there. Or it came, hey, where did this come from? What's its origin? And in the turn of the consciousness, you will actually feel like a thin thread or link the origin of it. And you will touch or know the nature of the origin and even the intent in the origin. And if you can reach to that point, then you can influence the origin also. So imagine what happens if you're feeling a whole range of thought imprints and you choose to then feel and act upon them, even neutralize, push back against them, etc. So he says, as it evolves in power, precision and clearness, 3 dimensions of their development. Power to act, you can amplify. Precision of the influence, you can improve. And then clarity, becomes possible to be aware more or less accurately and discerningly of the activities of minds, whether near to us physically or at a distance. And a whole range of phenomena he describes there of temperament. You can feel. I feel it's unfair to not go deeper into this. So, it becomes possible to be aware more or less accurately and discerningly of the activities of minds, whether near to us physically or at a distance, to understand, feel, or identify ourselves with their temperament, character, thoughts, feelings, reactions, whether by a psychic sense or a direct mental perception, or by a very sensible and often intensely concrete reception of them into our mind or on its recording surface. 4 different kinds of perception he is describing. So, a psychic sense, a direct mental perception, or concrete reception, or into the mind, or on its recording surface. Now, concrete perception into the mind would be in the mind. On its surface would be like a mirror, something reflecting on it. And these actually represent 4 different kinds of perceptions. Now, when you look at the literature all around of occult experiences of various kinds, of various people, you will find them sometimes referring to one or more of these, not distinguishing between them. They'll just say, oh, I felt, I saw, I sensed. But even in that, to distinguish between two or three would be a great thing, but they don't. To know that there are only 4 such means is already a knowledge which shows mastery. To be able to say that these are the 4 ways in which, and that's what you see in Sri Aurobindo. It is something so outstanding as to be unparalleled in the history of human spirituality or occult knowledge. There is no other equivalent of this kind of mastery and precision of experience and then articulation in knowledge of this whole range of phenomena. You can actually pause on each word and perhaps dig out examples and show the distinctions between all these, or dwell upon each of these and recognize how they are different and so on. Or not bother at all and blur it all into a big mass and say, oh, it's all occult phenomena. No, that's not what we want. We want to master it, and therefore this is necessary. At the same time, we can consciously make at least the inner selves, and if we are sufficiently sensitive, the surface minds of others aware of our own inner mental or psychic self, and plastic to its thoughts, suggestions, influences, or even cast it or its active image in influence into their subjective, even into their vital and physical being, to work there as a helping or molding or dominating power and presence. And just here are again several dozen kinds of phenomena of influence. So if you look at some of the remote viewing literature of the US military, those who were trained in that, many of them turned quickly to discovered the ability to remotely influence. So if they could view the state of another person, they could also modify and influence. I don't remember which book it was I had read, that they were monitoring day to day the plans of Saddam Hussein during Operation Desert Storm, 1992 if I am right, or 1991, I don't know. And daily they would monitor his intention. What was he planning to do next? What was his state? Was he afraid? Was he confident? And at some point they found they could also modify. They could plant suggestions, plant influences. Of course, all this they were just children discovering these capacities. But he is describing the full range. You can make someone's inner self impacted by an influence. Through the inner, you can make their outer surface mind aware. You can influence them to become plastic to a certain influence from you, to your thoughts, suggestions, influences, or even cast your consciousness or its active image in influence into their subjective being. So this is where Sri Aurobindo is describing that ability to infuse his consciousness into the disciples. cast it, the consciousness, or its active image. Active image means it's an image but which has a force of action. It's not entirely the consciousness. Into their vital and physical being. And once, when projected like that, work there as a helping or molding or dominating power and presence. So first it may be there as a help, it may actively engage and mold and shape, or it may dominate and change. Now I'm going to give one example here. When Mother spoke of this, she said whenever she met somebody in the meeting, an emanation of her consciousness was placed with the person for life, for lives, because it was placed with the psychic being, and so obviously it stays for lives. And she said that's always there, you can always call upon her help and it will be instantly effective. Obviously, she said, so there are several questions. One was, she said, when you call, it is effective. The help is there, but it is effective when you call, obviously because you open when you call. But the other thing she was asked, is it a part of you? She said, no. It's an emanation. Is an emanation a part? She said, no. It's the whole of my consciousness, but in an aspect that corresponds to your need or your soul's relation with her. So, what is it there first? As a helping influence. Now, if you open and give yourself, that same helping influence becomes a molding influence. It molds and shapes you. But there's still the part of your ego that says, I will only allow so much, I will only give myself so much. When that ego sense dims, gives itself and says, you are my all, then the relationship can be not just molding but dominating power and presence. When it dominates you and you are entirely yielding to it, then you have the most rapid shaping in the sadhana. But even with this, you find two words used, power and presence. So there's a presence, but there's also a power, and the power is the consciousness and the power of the consciousness. The two things and different aspects. It could be simply a presence, but not its power. It could be a power without the presence, or it could be power and presence. Many variations, innumerable. So what do you do with all this potential? So we'll close with this, because here we get the relinking to the spiritual intention. All these powers of the psychic consciousness need have and often have no more than a mental utility and significance, but can also be used with a spiritual sense and light and intention in it, and for a spiritual purpose. So by itself, even if you had this opening, you would say, yes, it's good, it's useful, it's interesting, but it has a mental utility, and if you used it for warfare, as the US military tried to seize upon some of these possibilities, and the Russian military also, Chinese are now into it in a big way. It's just for the same old game which you were doing with sticks and stones, then later with bows and arrows, then later with little bombs, and now with artificial intelligence driven missiles. Now you're shifting to an occult level, but it's the same game. Or somebody says, I want to improve my business potential, I want to gain more money, I want to achieve greater power, greater fame, greater whatever it is, acquire specific skills of knowledge, information, whatever it is. So need have and often have no more than a mental utility and significance. But you need not stop with that. You can turn this. It can also be used with a spiritual sense and light and intention in it, and for a spiritual purpose. So, this can be done by spiritual meaning and use in our psychical interchange with others. And it is largely by a psycho-spiritual interchange of this kind that a master in yoga helps his disciple. So these were some of the examples we had seen. But it's not true that all teachers are masters. So be careful about this use of the word master. It's common usage for people to say, oh, so and so, spiritual master. No, spiritual teacher. Teacher is not master. The bulk of the people you'll find on the internet and famous for spiritual whatever are teachers. They are not masters. Don't make the mistake of calling them masters. Or you may choose to call them, because for you the words are irrelevant. Master you use for somebody who has mastery. Otherwise, teacher. In Sanskrit, you have a better vocabulary. You have the word shikshak, somebody who gives shiksha, who gives lessons, lesson giver. Then there is acharya, one who is demonstrator by example. And then you have the one more term. After acharya, there's I don't remember the Sanskrit word, but somebody who influences you actively, not just as an example, but influences actively. And finally, the fourth, which is the guru, one who actively removes your ignorance and can infuse you with the light. That's already a different grade. But today all these words are loosely used. So, but be careful, don't make that mistake. Understand the difference, and here he's using these words with great precision. It is largely by a psycho-spiritual interchange of this kind that a master in yoga helps his disciple. And so it can be part of the spiritual interchange. The knowledge of our inner subliminal and psychic nature, of the powers and presences and influences there, and the capacity of communication with other planes and their powers and beings, can also be used for a higher than any mental or mundane object, for the possession and mastery of our whole nature and the overpassing of the intermediate planes on the way to the supreme spiritual heights of being. So even for example, let's say you went out of the body. What would you do? Let me go and spy on X. Let me see what they are doing. Let me see what are... Yes, that could be a domain, certainly. And there would be dangers associated because they also might want to protect themselves and you get into a conflict. And what we saw, for example, in the conference we had with Mark Obern, he said, the moment you're out of the body, do not bother with this world. Just go straight to the highest that you can reach. Go as high as you can, go into the higher ranges of worlds, and there you have an experience that is worthwhile. So one could actually set an objective where you use these experiences and these capacities to increase and accelerate the awareness as well as the awakening to deeper and higher ranges of consciousness, for the possession and mastering of our whole nature and the overpassing of the intermediate planes. You don't pause with those, you go straight to the higher ranges, on the way to the supreme spiritual heights of being. But the most direct spiritual use of the psychic consciousness is to make it an instrument of contact, communication and union with the divine. So think about this. All that we discussed so far, you can do this, feel that, influence that, etc. What if you turned all this to the divine straight? Instead of trying to feel other people's thoughts and influences or influence them, you open and make as tangible and deep and material contact as possible with the divine, and you give yourself in that. The same inner and higher opening and shift that you had turned now to accelerate your spiritual evolution by making a deeper and higher immersion and more complete immersion with the divine consciousness, not doable in your surface layers, even with great effort. So shift within, open and turn to the Divine Mother and give yourself from there. And then what you're able to achieve in terms of identification and receptivity and influence of the light and force, now shift and bring into your physical. Instead of trying to influence others, you influence your physical body, your surface layers. So you receive from above and you act upon your surface. And you see, it is a method of sadhana. It is the method of sadhana effectively, but now used entirely for the sadhana. A way of union with the divine, because in the inner the union is far more easy than in the outer. So this is what is the goal of the meditation. But this is what you could do in the body in meditation. But also in meditation one can enter states where you are above body, not out of body, but above body consciousness in the higher ranges, with that, which then you must bring into the physical and build the continuity and infusion. Or equally you could go out of the body and have the same thing in an out-of-body state, which then you bring in and infuse. A world of psycho-spiritual symbols is readily opened up, illuminating and potent and living forms and instruments, which can be made a revelation of spiritual significances, a support for our spiritual growth and the evolution of spiritual capacity and experience, a means towards spiritual power, knowledge, or ananda. He discusses some of the things, including the power of the mantra on those in the inner and higher ranges, as well as forms and symbolic representations of the divine, and the effect of the transmission of the consciousness received in this way. These and many more are the spiritual uses of the psychic consciousness and sense. And although capable of limitation and deformation, for all secondary instruments can also be, by our mental capacity of exclusive self-limitation, means of a partial but at the same time hindrances to a more integral realization. But still, he says, they are the greatest utility on the road to the spiritual perfection, and afterwards, liberated from the limitation of our minds, transformed and supramentalized, an element of rich detail in the spiritual ananda. And so all these layers, then he says, now that this chapter comes back to the main theme, all these layers are capable of a supramental transformation. And when the supermind lays hold on the psychical being, descends into it, changes it into the mold of its own nature, uplifts it to be a part of the supramental action and state, the supra-psychic being of the Vijnana Purusha is the result. And what is the effect of that, and all that he discusses, which we don't need to go into. He describes how the supramental entering organizes all these, and the tendencies for error and distortion which are natural to these layers are all dealt with. Everything is integrated and unified in a single working of the supramental sense, of which these are now special bodies and special ways of perception, and such is the direction towards which our spiritual evolution has to grow. So I will leave it at that, not go further into this text. So this was just the one text from the supramental sense. The other one is where he describes the planes of our existence. We will have to keep for another time, or maybe I will just summarize since I have left you the link. Those of you who would like, you can read this on your own. The second half of the chapter is the main portion relevant to the worlds, but here he discusses why and how the worlds form, and how finally we are one self which chooses to have relation with nature on various gradations of her working. That's how we have the experience of multiple worlds and therefore multiple bodies. So perhaps I will skip that and maybe just touch upon some key ideas when we discuss this topic next. There's one announcement I want to make for next Saturday, which is going to be a bit different. Next Saturday I have a commitment with the La Grace Center in the United States to speak there on a topic, but we have organized it so that we will webcast on this channel as we are doing currently at exactly the same time. So next Saturday at 7:30 on the YouTube channel you will find not this theme which we are currently doing, but a different topic, and the topic I have given as title Sri Aurobindo's Warnings Against the World State and the Present Trends. So this is largely based on the ideal of human unity, Sri Aurobindo's writings in the ideal of human unity, and some of it we have already touched in our discussions on current affairs, but here I will go in some detail on other aspects of it. So this completes our discussion for today. I will just quickly go through the chat box. There are some questions which are not directly related, and there are many questions pending. Please do not worry, no need to repeat them. I will take them up in the session after. Devika is asking, from which volume are you reading? I have given the link in the description, and it is from the Synthesis of Yoga. The chapter which is titled first the supramental sense, and the other chapter is the planes of our existence. Yes, so Kiara says there is the Ankh body of ancient Egyptian tradition. Yes, these all represent life force. The Ankh is a life force again, it is a vital body, and it can be projected beyond time, in the sense that in the vital plane one can look at or experience even the future, past, but always at the level of tendencies. So even the past is not always the past which actually happened. Even things which tried to happen can be experienced as if you're experiencing around you as a 3D. So you go in your either in body or out of body state, and you can see the past, be with the dinosaurs or whatever events that you're interested in. But again, there could be a mixture there of things which tried to happen mixing with what actually happened. And unless you have developed spiritually, unless the intuitive consciousness has filled the vital body sufficiently, you would not be able to distinguish these things. And that's why it's so important to have set the base early on, as early as you can, of two things. First and foremost, the psychic influence, which you can, let's say, associate with the love, devotion and self-giving that you have for the Divine Mother, for the Divine. Let that feeling suffuse your emotions, your life energies, your thoughts, and eventually your actions. If this suffusing has been sufficiently done, in the body or out of body state, when you meet with things, you will feel spontaneously in the psychic intuition something is mixed, or what is true or what is not. Into this now, if you open to the higher influence and descent, first the peace and then the light and the force which fill from above, with it the intuitive influence will fill and grow until, as you know, oh, there's a mixture here, you'll be able to distinguish what is the nature of the mixture and why and how to correct it. Even specific precise knowledge will fill these perceptions. RG is asking about Manas Puja, where you do a whole puja ritual done in the mind instead of the physical body, taking leaves, coconut, flowers and doing a whole ritual. You do it in the mind. Yes, it's pretty much the same thing, but for people who live in the physical body, you need physical objects. You can shift your consciousness and in consciousness do the same thing, acquire sometimes more intense results. But the truth of it, what is a flower? What is a coconut? What is this whole ritual of lighting a flame? Go back to the inner truth of it, and then you find that it's no more a ritual, it becomes a state of the spiritual experience. The lighting of the flame is your turning and awakening and intensifying your aspiration. The offering of the fruits is the movement of self-giving, of parts and powers of your consciousness. The flowers representing qualities of your consciousness. The breaking of the coconut is the breaking of your narrow ego shell to be open and give yourself, etc. So at that point you discard the ritual entirely and go through a psycho-spiritual process in relation to the divine, which you can do anywhere. The divine is not in the idol in front of you, but in the divine presence which is surrounding you everywhere. So yes, there is a principle to it, and the Manas Puja is still just a one shift above from the physical exercise, but the true shift would be a direct spiritual turning and opening. Yes, Shiva says there is a lot of discussion in the EWS series 101 to 104 about the purification. I think you will all find that helpful. So Bruno is asking, at what level do the waves of gravitational waves are detected at the level of LIGO, etc.? They are purely physical, and even what passes as gravitational waves is not really that. It has to do with the physical ether and the ripples in the physical ether. After all, even electromagnetism are flows and processes of the physical ether. All that we are describing as psychical phenomena relates to what is called the Sukshma subtle Akasha, or the subtle ether. Sri Aurobindo distinguishes two ethers, the physical ether and the subtle ether, and all the inner worlds are on the subtle ether. So they represent two different grades altogether. So you won't find in this, obviously, the scientific, the link between the scientific and the occult, but if you recognize that the gross physical ether is a densification of the subtle ether, There you find the link. Therefore, any ripple created on the subtle ether would affect the physical ether, but not necessarily vice versa. Or you could have, but not as much. So this is what happened with Ingo Swann. He was taken to a physical laboratory where there was it's called Hall effect junction, held in very cold temperatures in a huge machine which was under the ground, under his feet. He was brought into this empty room and they said, now influence the object. Which is the object? He says, oh, that's below your feet. It's so big. So, and they don't tell him what it is. So he tries to feel with his consciousness. And the point where he makes contact with the object, he senses it. This is now a vital which is almost materialized. So he senses it in the material vital, and it's like he's touching with his fingers, except it's in the material vital. And as he's touching it and feeling it, he's drawing a sketch on the paper, the shape that he feels, and at the same time the machine which is registering the signals goes crazy. And that was the evidence, of course, that he was influencing it. So you understand that if you modify things on the subtle ether, it has a ripple effect in the physical ether. And that's your link. You want to link it deeper, you say all ether is substance of consciousness. And so all physical processes, all physical forces being processes in the ether are really processes in consciousness, but a materialized, densified substantiality of consciousness, and so on. There you have the link from the subtle spiritual experience to the physical world, and that's your bridge through which everything is possible, and even a whole new set of technologies could be conceived of and utilized. So I think I've touched broadly the questions here. I want to review key points of today. All our existing senses are dulled, reduced, tail-end projections of a deeper, truer, spiritual, supramental sense. It's the exaggerated outward turn of our consciousness and its fixation through the physical senses, which is like the veil that blocks us from the deeper ranges, where already we are conscious, or a part of us is conscious. But those ranges are not well organized, they are not sufficiently developed. There's a whole range of possibilities there, not yet tapped, except what may have been done indirectly across lives, which is there then present in you. By consciously disengaging from this surface fixation and bringing your five senses and your awareness inward, centering it within, for which the easiest point of reference is your inward aspiration to the divine, and opening from there and giving yourself to the divine, you establish yourself in a deeper and higher state, range, from which then on the return you can slowly, gradually infuse and link to the surface, and thus build the continuity. With it comes the ability now, precisely the powers of the inner ranges, which now you are developing indirectly, to turn the consciousness of those inner and higher ranges directly in relation to the divine. Give yourself open to the divine. Ask for that to grow in depth of intimacy, of contact, presence felt. With it spontaneously comes the awareness of that same presence felt everywhere around you, not just within you. With it comes the perception of things on the subtle and inner ranges, because after all, you are living or receiving on those ranges. But you are not fixated and lost or distracted from the lower vital ranges and the dangers associated with the lower turn of these perceptions. Your perception is always inwardly and upwardly turned, so receiving only things from the deeper and higher, and even when occasionally other things come, you instantly distinguish qualitatively this as grosser, cruder, less true than that which is the light, force, purity, love, beauty of the divine consciousness, and that remains your priority. So you realize in this spiritual turn you are actually developing capacities and powers innate to the inner, but not in their exercise downward, in their exercise upward, and for an accelerated spiritual development. And at this point, all that we have discussed earlier in terms of the sadhana and the spiritual development from the episode number 82 onwards, all that links with this. So you understand how even the occult development is implied in the spiritual when taken in this way, but not always. not in an ascetic path, that may not be. But also with the spiritual development, when taken in this way, there is the development of these intermediate gradations of consciousness, and if you so choose, you may take up certain experiences along certain lines, which for our purpose now, we are focusing on two things. Becoming conscious of the link from the inner and higher ranges to the surface through first awareness in the dream state and as you wake up from dream, and increasingly, second, where we can become conscious in those parts where we may be able to separate consciously and experience as an out-of-body experience, which will be a topic that we will touch upon later. But for now, build it in this way. Let this become your base of growth and priority spiritually. And as this becomes strong and stable enough, the rest will become easy. So we'll continue the topic in the week after, but for next week we will have a special theme on which is organized by the Lagras Center, but on the channel at the same time as usual here. Let's take a moment to concentrate in this, all that we've received, understood, but especially with it this turn of the spiritual that comes and the implied occult development of those layers, but by spiritual means. And let all of our energies be turned to opening to the divine, receiving the divine, giving ourselves to the divine as our first priority.